Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here, today introducing a new video series that Jonas and I will be covering. We've been discussing lately the possibility of breaking down list building into its discrete parts so that we can kind of do a deeper dive on generic list building and not just Lumineth or other order armies or those that we see in our battle reports or book reviews. And though today's particular topic is just a solo outing for me, which will be this knapsack spam, say that 5 times fast, idea that comes from computer programming, we're going to be trying to cover a bunch of different possible topics over the next however many months. And unlike the Math Hammer series, it won't necessarily be in a pedagogically ordained order, if you will, where we're trying to make sure that it's systematically logical from one video to the next. It'll probably skip around a bit based off of what we have interest in at the moment, but we'll get more into that in a minute. Let's take a look at the general overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll first break down the list building series in general, then moving on to the generic idea of knapsacking, and the applied variant for making your list here in Age of Sigmar. Then we'll look at 2 basic ideas, which will be applying this to a simple battle line and then applying it to a restricted battle line, which I'll explain a little bit later, and then of course some concluding thoughts. But before we move any further, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all the good internet stuff, join the Discord, and let us know what you thought about this video, and which of the following topics I'm about to discuss you'd like to see sooner than later in the list building series. Now, as you'll notice, I've been putting Idoneth art up on this video, which might get some of you Lumineth fans out there a little bit riled up, seeing as it seems to make sense we should probably be focusing on Lumineth content for this video. But because I was originally an Idoneth player, that was my first army, and it was actually, we're roughly at the 1-year mark since I did my first video with Jonas, somewhere around there, which was on the Idoneth Battletome review, and then the second video was talking about Idoneth allies in Lumineth. Seems fitting to be covering it here. Plus, once we get a general sense of what knapsacking is, I think you'll understand why I chose Idoneth. But we are still keeping it within the elf family, and just 1 generation off from the Lumineth, with Teclis's sort of aborted attempt at rebuilding the elves in the mortal realms. But anyway, so the list building series could be split into general topics and niche topics, of which today's will definitely be more of a niche-y topic. And though I haven't discussed this with Jonas already, I know that he'll probably have plenty of thoughts on a number of these topics, and there'll be more to add as well. So potential general topics would include essential unit function types like screens and hammers, anvils, all that kind of thing, mobile objective grabbers. And I know Jonas definitely has interest in this topic. Then we've got army battle trait archetypes, which is something I find really interesting, of what actually defines an army's battle traits, which is a topic unto itself. Maximizing synergy within your army in your list building. I have a typo here. To reinforce units or not. I originally wrote it reinforcing units or not. So to reinforce units or not, this is often a matter of their range and how much flexibility you need in splitting your units across the table. Using core battalions versus your drop count. This is obviously a perennial question which changes a bit with the season, but always is, especially for competitive games, very important. And then when to swap out units and enhancements from a list you've already tried a bit. Some more niche topics would be utilizing allies and coalition, one of my kind of pet projects in general. Everyone that knows me knows that I like to diversify my list as much as possible and like soup lists. So for those of you on the same page as me out there, I'm definitely interested in breaking that down. Also, a super niche topic is null deploying, which, if you're not familiar, is the idea of literally putting nothing on the table during deployment, because you can set things in reserve, which only about 7 or so armies can do, of which that video will end up covering the differences between those different armies and who has it better and worse for doing that strategy, and whether it's even smart to do. Maintaining bubbles. This is actually super interesting, especially based off of radiuses, radii off of different base types. And this is halfway a Math Hammer video, but we can talk about it in a more generic sense and then maybe do a Math Hammer follow-up. Threat range, also a little bit of a Math Hammer idea. And I know Honest Wargamer Rob has covered this for sure, but this has to do with not only how fast your unit can move, but also what it's usually with shooting units, their power projection is. Then we've got building for battle tactics or battle plans. You could argue this is a general topic, but seeing that battle tactics and battle plans change every season, I feel like this ends up falling into a bit of more niche-y realm there. And then using well-rounded versus niche lists. Now, this would be, say, for competitive players that don't know who they'll be playing at a given tournament, trying to build a list that can take on all comers versus writing something that's particularly niche-y and leans in one particular direction, so that maybe for a teams format, or if you know your meta is very particular, trying to build towards that, or just for the hell of it. But let's move on. So the idea of knapsacking, which is our topic for today, is taken out of a general idea that we all kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis, or maybe not day-to-day, but we've certainly thought about in our lives. But it's usually applied to how much of a discrete item you want to use of a certain limited quality based off of how much value you place on it. And this is an algorithm we use in computer science quite often in early computer science algorithm studies. So as I noted here, we're given weights and values to fit in a knapsack with limited space. In this photo to the right, we see a knapsack which has a maximum weight of 13. So this is its capacity. And then we see 4 different items of value: gold, diamonds, rubies, and coins, that each have their own weight and implicit value. Now, obviously, the weight is fixed, how much space it occupies, but the value is obviously subjective from one person to the next. The idea with this algorithm is to achieve maximum value in that knapsack, often with as much of the most efficient or valuable item as possible, meaning you're often going to end up spamming the thing that weighs that has the most value per weight ratio. But you could obviously swap out your values based off of what you're looking to make. And we'll talk about that in Warhammer in a minute here. So in this particular scenario, you would take the value divided by the weight and try to see how much of the best thing you could fit in there. And then if you have any space left over, you're going to end up using the next highest object. Unless there's a version of this where by taking maybe the second most efficient thing would have allowed you to squeeze in just a little bit more value. So that's kind of the idea here. And the algorithm itself runs through all the possibilities, but can eventually more or less rule out less efficient things because they don't hit an upper bound or lower bound as needed. My last point here is that value in Warhammer is often difficult to assess, but unit costs and list capacities are simple. So for example, the value you place on a unit is not necessarily some standard value as gold or diamonds, but is going to be based off of a complicated mixture of what kind of synergies you're getting out of those units and what you particularly like, your utility in using that. Maybe you want to play a super Timmy list where you only take monsters as battle line. Or maybe you want to go with a horde list, and this is of higher value to you than other things. Essentially, all you're doing is putting a priority on one given concept, leaning into it as hard as possible, and then filling in the rest based off of some minimum restrictions that you need to have. Like I said, unit costs and list capacities are simple. So let's move on to that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So applying it to Warhammer, some of our restrictions are you have to have 1 to 6 leaders, so no more than 6 in a 2,000 point game, and at least 1 to be your general, right? So you can't just do all monsters, we know that. You have to have at least 3 battle line, which even if your monsters were battle line, if they're not heroes somehow, leaders, then that's not going to work. And as you're probably aware, whenever you make a behemoth battle line, it loses the leader trait. So it's not going to be that anymore. It doesn't lose hero, but it does lose leader. So you still would need an extra general. And then 0 to 4 behemoths. So this is already putting enough of an idea of what fits in a bag and what we have to put in that bag. It's not a simple knapsacking problem because we already have some constraints, as we would say in this parlance and this way of talking about things. And then the values are, of course, the weights are how much they cost regarding points. So I said here, the value is determined by what type of unit or play style the player wants to maximize. So this would include things like min-maxing elements like magic, shooting, mobility, or even model count. Maybe you want a lot for hordes or very few because you like elite armies that are, for lack of a better way of saying it, more Timmy-esque. Meaning you like to play with your big fun monster toys, and that's a high priority for you. If you're not familiar with the idea of min-maxing, this is also coming from like RPGs and other video game and nerd culture, gaming culture, where essentially you're trying to lean super heavily into one particular thing, one particular benefit, and then minimizing all of the risks along with that. So you're maxing out one thing and trading out by minimizing some other things. Okay, so though spam is often a bad idea, seeing the upper bounds of what's even possible gives us a good starting point for list building. And you'll definitely see this as we look at this process applied to Ideneth. Which, while I'm on the topic, the reason I chose Ideneth over Lumineth is that Ideneth has fewer units, especially after Lumineth got the Broken Realms / second Battle Tome update, and will probably continue to get more units when the other temples come out. Also, Ideneth has quite easy to wrap your head around battle line options, but has flexible options. They've got a few unconditional battle line that are just always battle line, Enthralls and Reavers, and then we've got a number of conditional battle line with even 2 different conditions. One's a sub-faction type condition and one's a general condition. So this was a good example for what we could be dealing with. And by having not so many models in the range, the knapsacking problem gets a lot simpler. Whereas if we look at something like Cities of Sigmar or Stormcast Eternals, with so many units to choose from, the just listing all the possibilities gets a little obnoxious. So my last point here is tweaking and refining from there after you've built a spam list, adjusting based not only on overall flexibility and efficiency, but also reasonable collection goals for your army. So for example, I love the idea of spam armies, but if you think about it, if you literally spam, let's say the 11 dragons list in Stormcast, you did implicitly by spamming buy as many as possible dragons as can fit in the list. And let's say they never raise the price on those dragons in terms of points. There's only one list you can build that uses them. So you better love that list or be comfortable selling your stuff away or just having extra models that aren't getting any use on the shelf. So for example, I only have 6 dragons in my Stormcast list or my collection. I would consider doing more. I don't consider maybe another 2 to be too risky, but once you start hitting a certain point, you're essentially forcing yourself down that spam list road, and then you're spending a lot of money chasing after one dream. This is where TTS really comes in handy for people that want to test out spam lists but don't have to own all the models. Of course, you can always proxy things, but you'll never really get to see how that works in a tournament setting unless you borrow models from friends, which is also a way to do it. So, also reasonable collection goals, and just in general, is how many of something you not only want to buy, but you actually want to push around. You might not want to have just a monochromatic type list where you're only using one type of unit. You might find that boring. It might be fun for a few experimental games, but not everyone's built for doing that. And a lot of times, that said, it's not the most efficient. So this idea of tweaking and refining from there is more figuring out a baseline of what the max of something you could possibly fit in your list would be, and then pulling back from there. So let's move on to the actual case study of Ideneth here. This is a breakdown of all of the relevant units I wanted to talk about in the Ideneth Deepkin army. I've listed first the 5 battle line in ascending points cost, And then we've got ascending points costs for the remaining units, all of which here are heroes. If you're not aware, Idoneth is one of these armies where you can literally build every single iterable unit, or non-hero unit, I should say, can be battle line in specific lists. So, as I mentioned, we've got Namarti Thralls at the cheapest for 130. It's a unit of 10, and their default battle line, unconditional battle line. And Reavers, the Archer variant, which is 170 for 10. Then, if you're in the sub-faction Feuilleton, your Alopexes, which are your sharks, are also at 170, but for only 1. And they're, like I said, battle line if you're in Feuilleton. The Achaian Guard, this would be both types of eels, are Isheron and Morsar, or Ishlian, excuse me. Isheron is the name of the priest caste in, or whatever you want to call it, in Idoneth. One of them's a priest. They both cost 80 now. They've been different points at different times, but fortunately for this video, we're only having to, we can swap, mix and match, because they both cost the same, for a unit of 3 cavalry. And their battle line, if your king, your general is a king, as in either Volturnos or an Achaian king. Good to know, if you take Volturnos in your list, even if he's not the official general, he's a war master and counts as one, so this turns this on. So that's good. And then finally, the Achaian Leviathan, which is the turtle, has reduced in cost to 460, which is good, because now you can take even more if you want to spam that list. And this is battle line if in Nautilar, one of the other sub-factions. Furthermore, we've got 2 unique heroes, one of which I already mentioned is Volturnos and Lotan. Lotan's one of the better options for just the army in general, and it's nice that he's so cheap, and he turns on your rituals, being an Isheron himself. Of course, he's unique, so you can't take a command trait for him or an artifact. And then the rest, we've got the Thrall Master, who boosts Namarti, the Soul Render, who brings back Namarti, the Tidecaster, who's a wizard and gives you 2 rituals, the Soul Scryer, which lets you do the Deep Strike with 2 units, or 3 if you're in Briamdar subfaction. Achaian King, which is the Slap King, as people have come to know him, with the current build of artifacts, spell, and command trait, and mount trait. Volturnos, as I mentioned, and then 2 Eidolons, the more punchy one, the Storm, and the Wizard variant, which is the Eidolon of the Sea, both of which are heroes. All right. So let's start with something. Oh, before I start with something basic, this is the list of 6 different things I chose to cover here as spam. We're going to start small and get big. So we're looking at Thralls, and we're going up in points cost is what we're doing here. So Thralls to Reavers are both of simple battle line, unconditional battle line. And then we've got more restrictive cases, such as Alopexes in Feuilleton, Eels with a king as general, the Leviathan in Nautilar, or Eidolon the Storm, which is kind of an outlier here in that he's already a hero, so you don't need to officially have a general in the list. You're not forced to take another model. All right, let's move on to our Thralls. So this is our first example of simple battle line. And as we said, every single list needs at least 1 hero plus 3 battle line. Since these guys are already battle line and you're trying to spam them as is, then what we're looking at is just taking 1 extra hero. So the way the math works on this is super easy. You have 2,000 points. You subtract any obligations. So you could subtract the cheapest point that you could possibly, points cost you could possibly take for a hero. So in this case, that could be your general, not an allied hero. It would be 110 points for either a Lotan or a Thrall Master. So now we're at 1890, and then you divide that by the cost of the unit you're trying to spam, which is in Thralls at 130 points here, and see how many full units you can fit into that points cost, which at 1820, as you see here, is 14 units of 10 Thralls. So we're talking about 140 bodies and 1 foot hero at 180 points left over. Of course, you can mix and match an endless spell in there if you want or whatever. There's no way to fit any other type of unit in here without giving up some of those Thralls, because we're focusing on the heroes themselves. After you spend 110, you're only going to have 70 points left over, which is enough for an endless spell, but it may be an allied unit like either wings, but mostly we're not really concerned with that. You'd figure out another way to use those points. And 180 points is not enough to buy 2 heroes. All right, so what we're going to do in these slides is kind of up the ante of kind of leaning into a different build. And I've put at most 4 builds on each of these slides. So this one's got Thralls plus 1 Eidolon of the Storm. The idea being that the Eidolon of the Storm gives a 12-inch Holier Than Bubble that gives you +1 to wound for all your Idoneth guys in melee. Notably, it doesn't boost the mounts of different units, which is a large chunk of the army, but considering we're spamming Thralls, it's going to be benefiting the Thralls fully, which is good, putting them at 3s and 2s, -1, and whatever the damage or attacks characteristic is based off the unit, the wounds characteristic of the target. And then we can fit in Lotan or a Thrall Master or a Soul Render, all of which benefit the Thralls pretty well. So you'd have 2 heroes in this list. And that Lotan's also doing the same effect that the Eidolon's doing. So you'd have 2 bubbles for your 120 Thralls in this list, so 12 units of 10. And of course you can reinforce freely up to your max of 4 reinforcements. Another version would be maximizing Thralls while saying I'm going to take 1 Leviathan. So again, how this works is 2,000 points, minus a minimum of 110 for a leader, minus 460 for the 1 Leviathan, then dividing that by 130 for the Thralls, and that comes out to exactly 11, so 110 units. I mean, 110 models, so 11 units. Still a lot of dudes. Plus a Leviathan, which is projecting a bubble. You can make it as big as 15-inch, which is giving them not only +1 to save, but is also giving them +1 to hit if the target enemy unit is in that bubble. So you've got a very solid castle here. Whether all those Thralls can fit in that bubble is another question. But you could always, of course, take some Thralls out to start adding back in some more buff pieces like Thrall Masters or Soul Renders or whatever you feel like you need. And then last build here is 2 Leviathans, which we don't usually recommend, but now that they've gotten a little cheaper, it could be a thing, especially with this many Thralls, because then you're projecting that bubble twice. So there's a better chance that all 70 of the Thralls you'd be able to fit in this list are going to be able to stand in that bubble for +1 to save at all times, and would be getting the +1 to hit against a good number of the enemy units. And then we have 170 points left over for 1 foot hero. So some remarks. Outside of allies, like Cities of Sigmar units that are like 80 points for 10 guys, this is the most Horde IDK can get, which is good for bodies. Such builds are implicitly low on heroes and full synergy pieces, so as I mentioned, you'd have to swap some things out. You're free to choose your sub-faction on this one since it's simple battle line. But Domhain has the most synergy. It's kind of the default setting if you're going to be running a certain amount of Namarti, because you can, depending on what part of the battle round you're in, you can either redeploy 3 times for 1 CP with Namarti, or after a Namarti unit fights and kills something, if it's no longer within combat of something, it can then make a charge and fight later in that combat phase, which is pretty strong. Nautilar or Morphon would be somewhat decent if you wanted one of the Leviathans to count as one of your battle line and give it the monstrous rampage that lets its attacks fight at -3 Ren for that turn. Or Morphon if you have some Soul Renders in the list for bringing back extra Namarti. Of course, this would only impact 1 unit of Thralls, but it would make you even tankier. Alright, let's move on to Reavers. So, we've got some Reavers here. This is the shooty version, and spamming this is probably going to do even more work than the Thralls because you're not quite at the mercy of how close your opponent comes, because you've got an 18-inch range, and if they're within 9-inch, you're getting +1 to hit automatically with your War Scroll for the Reavers. Each of them getting 2 attacks, 3s, -1/1, but that becomes 2s and 3s -1/1. If they're either within the bubble of the turtle, if you end up taking a turtle, or if you're within 9 inches. As you'll see here, I've only got 3 lists listed, the max spam version, which we'll always start with, and then 1 or 2 Leviathans. The reason being that throwing in an Eidolon or even Lotan makes them better in combat, but only in combat, and they don't really want to be in combat, so it's not necessarily a build that's worth talking about. Same kind of thing for using the King's buffs or Volturnos' buffs. It helps some amount, but going for Reaver spam really is mainly just about doing as much damage from afar as possible. So the max possible number of Reavers you can fit in there is 11 units of 10, so 110, which is a crazy amount of damage. And then you're putting one Soul Render, which would help bring some back, a Thrallmaster, which would give them a bubble of -1 to wound for a 12-inch bubble, or Lotan, who's not doing much for them. Then we could do a Leviathan build, which takes us down from 110 Reavers to 80 Reavers, still a lot, which means you could reinforce all 4 of them for 4 units of 20, kind of interesting. And taking a Leviathan to project that bubble. Obviously, they're not all going to fit in that bubble, but because they're on 32 millimeters, and that's a lot. To fit in there, I mean. And then you've got one hero, which could be all the options, including Elethane and his Soul Raid, if you want to bring. That's the Underworlds or Warcry. I guess it's Underworlds Warband. But I wouldn't recommend it. Then we have the 2 Leviathans build, which takes us all the way down to 50 Reavers, but then you got 2 Leviathans, and don't forget the Leviathans each have 8 shots at 3s -1 D3 damage. So you're getting some more shooting power in there, which is kind of nice, and then some melee backup or, support there. And you could, with 230 points left over, we're looking at 1 to 3 or 1 to 2 foot heroes if you did a couple of the cheap ones. You could, like a 120 for a Soul Render and 110 for Lotan or a Thrallmaster. You could actually get 2 in there. So some remarks. This is still good for objectives because you've still got a lot of bodies even in the 2 Leviathan version. And it has significantly more firepower and thus range. And there's less synergy needed from your heroes for shooting. As I mentioned, there just aren't that many things that buff them as a shooting unit. You're also free to choose your sub-faction still, where Domhain has more synergy, but less than it did with Thralls. And you could still do Nautilus if you're taking Leviathans, or Morphon if you're using Soul Renders. So similar kind of story. Let's move on to some restricted battle line. So starting with Alopexes, which are the same points cost as the Reavers. The Alopexes, if you don't know, the Sharks are a really good balance of speed, flying at 14 inches, wounds. They've got a 4-up save with 8 wounds apiece, not bad, and their shooting and melee attacks are both solid. You can choose between a shooting attack that turns off pile-in moves if it hits, but it's kind of risky, and you can also do one that's just doing pure damage at 4 attacks, 3/3s, -1 D3. So you could get max 11 Sharks in one list. Now it's worth pointing out that they're going to have to be in Feuilleton, which is their sub-faction, and the ability that comes with Feuilleton, as I'll mention in the remarks there, isn't the Bloodthirsty Shivers rule is a trap. I can do math on that for you guys later sometime, but it almost never proves to be better off than just simply taking the same number of units single reinforced, so that one of the Sharks becomes a hero and you're getting +1 to hit on everything. But anyway, 11 Sharks is definitely a lot of firepower and melee power, but not very many units for holding objectives because each Shark only counts as 2 models and objectives. So we're looking at 22 plus 2 for a hero, or so we're looking at 24 bodies and objectives. Not a lot, so you really need to remove some stuff. Again, spam lists are often not the right way to go, but it's interesting to see what the upper limits are. We could pair them with one of either a king and Volturnos, which is 250 for a king or 270 for Volturnos, which is great because the king allows D3 units once per game to fight as though it's high tide, and Volturnos lets them during high tide once per game get +1 attack in melee. Plus, both of them are boosting the riders to hit rolls. And you can make the Acalian King the Slap King, which does a lot. At this point, you only have to give up 1 Alopex to make that possible, and then you've got some leftover points for an endless spell if you end up going Slap King route, giving you Arcane Tome, and then having a backup thing if you don't want to cast Flaming Weapon for some reason. We could also do Acalian King and Volturno, since their abilities don't stack on top of each other too much. We're down to 8 Alopexes if we do that, and then you still got room for Lotan, a Soul Render, a Thrallmaster. The latter 2 don't really help much, but I've listed them just for the sake of it. But Lotan does, and is giving +1 to wound for even the mounts. So this is actually a decently strong build if you want to go very elite. I actually think this could do some work. between the king, Volturnos, and Loton with those 8 Alopexes. And then we've got the 1 Leviathan plus the king and Volturnos. I did do with just one or the other, but I only wanted to put 4 lists on here. So that puts us down to 6 Alopexes, which would be precisely what you could do for 3 battle line units, each reinforced. So you're getting a hero in each unit, plus 1 Leviathan, who is not giving them the +1 to hit, but is giving them +1 save. Because they have a wounds count of 8 or less, and that applies to the King and Volturnos too, which could be nice. So you're walking around with a tight bubble if you want, or can spread out. Everyone's moving pretty fast except for the Leviathan, which is still not slow at 10 inches, I believe. And that's that list. So remarks here, it's super elite with balanced speed, range, and melee, but its such builds are implicitly low on objective control. As I mentioned, you're locked to Phaeton for the Alopex battle line, but its ability is kind of useless, the Bloodthirsty Shiver. I think it's a trap. And the minimum tax for taking any other sub-faction here is 390 points. So the math on that works out as 2,000 points minus your battle line tax for 390, at least for 3 units of 10 thralls at 130 apiece, minus the cost of at least 1 leader, 110, and then dividing by 170 for the Alopexes, which is definitely going to reduce the amount of Alopexes you can take. So even though I don't love the Phaeton ability, the fact that you can max out sharks is kind of interesting. So now let's move on to something a little different here. Here we see that we've got the Acalian Guard, which would be either the Ishlian defensive or Morsar offensive eel variety, both of which are priced the same at 180 points. Now, unlike the previous example with the sharks, these guys become battle line. They're battle line if, or a conditional battle line based off of who your general is, which means you have to take at least 1 copy of either the king or Volturnos, which of course is fulfilling your leader role, and then you have however many points left over. So that's going to look like 2,000 points minus at least 250 or 270 if you want Volturnos, divided by the cost of eels at 180. Then you see how many you can fit in, and then you use the remaining points for whatever you want. So in our max spam version, we see that we can fit in 9 times 3 of mix and match Ishlian or Morsar Guard, and then we have to spend 250 to 270 points on either the king or Volturnos respectively, leaving us with 110 if it's Volturnos or 130 points if it's the king, points left over to be spending on Loton, a Soul Render, Thrallmaster, or even 10 times Thralls for screens or objective control if you got the king. So that's your basic list there. We can move on to taking both the king and Volturnos, since their abilities stack nicely with the eels, which only makes us lose 1 unit of 3 eels. So that means we could still max out at reinforced units, 4 units of reinforced, or however you like to do it. The problem being that Morsar's Biovoltaic Blast ability, that's a once per game ability at the beginning of the combat phase or into the charge, one or the other, does more damage if your unit is smaller than the target unit, so making them bigger might not be the right call. But maybe for screens, Ishlian, maybe that's a good idea. Anyway, in either case, you're spending 520 points for both the king and Volturnos combined, which gives us 40 points left over for maybe an endless spell if you go with the Slap King, who can cast that instead of Flaming Weapon. Another build would be taking a Leviathan. It's worth pointing out that though the eels, the Morsar eels will benefit from +1 to save, and so will the king or Volturnos, the Leviathan itself can't help the Ishlian because they have an unimprovable or able to be worsened save. It's an ethereal save that, yes, can get better if they charge to a 3-up ethereal, but no amount of cover or the Leviathan's ability will help them. So you're chasing good money after bad, as we say, by taking too many Ishlian in this build, but it could be a thought. They're still unrendable. They're just not benefiting from the 460 points you added to the list. But otherwise, we're getting 7 copies of the eels, and then 10 to 30 points left over for an endless spell. I think the cheapest endless spell at this point is 30, used to be 20, so you're only getting to do that if you took the Slap King, which you're probably doing anyway. And then we've got one Leviathan with both the king and Volturnos, which puts us down to 5 copies of Eels. And then you have 120 points left over for something like Loton, which of course is boosting the efficiency there. Definitely interesting. I think if I were going for an Eel spam list, I'd either do the Achillean King and Volturnos for 8 units of Ishlian or Morsar Guard, or maybe even consider that first build, which is just one or the other, with Loton coming along to give +1 to wound. So the max spam list isn't the worst on here. I feel like the Leviathan does some amount of work, but it might not be worth the trade-off. So as per remarks, this is a mid-elite build, since we are taking not units of 1 Shark, or as we'll see in the next slide, 1 Leviathan that we're spamming, but 3 models, so that helps a little bit more for objective control in a sense, and certainly bodies on the table. But it's balanced with speed and punch. So decent. And as we know, eel spam used to be a thing, so this isn't the craziest of spam ideas. But such builds are implicitly low on objective control, but better than Shark's build, and you still have a free sub-faction choice as opposed to the Sharks, though it's probably best in Iron Rock, which has a heroic action that lets you essentially, for Achillean units, or an Achillean unit, be affected by High Tide or Ebb Tide at the same time, which is giving you run and charge or retreat and charge. And then the taxation here is with the king in general, though fortunately that tax is a good one because the kings are buffing the eels because they're all Achillean and they like to be in combat, so it's not the worst. Let's move on to the one you're probably wondering about, the big boys, the Leviathans. If you take them in Nautilus, you're getting them as battle lines, which means they lose the behemoth role. That said, you can't fit 5 of these in a list anyway, so making them not behemoths doesn't change whether they would be able to... you could take more than 4 of them, because you can't take more than 4 of them with these points anyway. That said, they would be battle line now, which means if they're within 1 inch of a GC, then they can't be targeted. That GC can't be targeted. And furthermore, as far as battalions, they count as troops now, which is kind of interesting because they're not a behemoth anymore. But the max you can fit in is 4 Leviathans and then 1 foot hero of whatever sort, excluding Elethane's Soul Raid, because that's 180 points. You'd probably want to go with Loton here. That's the most logical choice, unless you want to do a null deploy with a Soul Scryer, which could be kind of interesting. I could maybe see that. 4 Leviathans, though, is super memey, and they do a lot of work, but I don't know that it's going to be able to win games. But bumping down to the next level would put you at 3 Leviathans with an Achillean King or Volturnos. And then you have a bunch of points left over for flavoring to taste, as I listed here, which could be max 2 times 10 Thralls with 90 to 110 points left over, or 2 times 10 Reavers with 10 to 30 points left over, or 2 times 1 Alopex at 10 to 30 points left over, and 1 to 2 times 3 Eels plus 10 to 170 points left over. Why did I write it like that? Oh, it depends on whether you take the king or Volturnos. That's what it is, because a unit of eels is 100. 2 units of eels is 360 points. So the only way you can do that is if you take the Achillean King. That's why we did it like that. And then it leaves you either 10 points left over or 170, which clearly gives you enough to buy something like another Alopex or something. So that's actually got more than it might seem with just you've got 3 Leviathans and then either a king or Volturnos. And then in the last option here, we did 3 Leviathans with a king and Volturnos plus 100 points worth of allies, because nothing in Ideneth is cheaper than 100 points, or 110, I mean. You could, of course, a much better decision would probably be taking 2 Leviathans and then just running with it. But we've already seen plenty of, even in this video today, talking about meme lists, we've even seen 2 Leviathan builds. So we've already basically covered that territory. And you can mix and match, swap things out. So some remarks. It's a Timmy-esque monster hammer, and probably not actually good, but could be worth trying, and at least one of them is getting to use that Nautilus -3 rend ability, which is kind of cool. Plus, unlike heroic actions, monstrous rampages, each one of these is still getting to do one. So if you've got 3 in a list, you're getting one that's getting your extra rend, one that's doing stomp, and one that's doing roar. So not bad. And they have their own version of Stomp too, which is still Stomp, but it's a better, improved version of it. So anyway, there are many buffs from the turtles that are not being utilized and therefore are inefficient points-wise. So for example, the +1 to save is only really helping the King or Volturnos, and then whatever units you bring along. And then the +1 to hit is only applying to the Namarti units. So unless you're bringing some Namarti, you're not benefiting from it so much. Again, these builds only work in Nautilar, but the monstrous action for one of the turtles is solid, like I said. And taking outside of Nautilar requires a minimum of 390 points worth of Thralls as tax. So just like before, we're doing 2,000 points, minus 390, minus at least 110 for a hero, then dividing by 460 for the turtles, which probably puts you at 2 turtles. Actually, you could... No, I think you can fit 3 in. You can definitely fit 3 in still. But whether it's efficient or not is up to debate. And then lastly, a kind of a outlier here is we're spamming a hero. And this isn't exactly the normal build here, because you're trying to spam the Eidolon of the Storm at 320 points, which is the melee version of the Eidolon. What you're functionally doing is giving yourself a general. You're fulfilling the general minimum requirement by default. So then all you got to do is be taxed with 390 points of Thralls at minimum. Of course, you can bump that up to something more if you want, but we've assumed Thralls for this build. So the max version is 5 Eidolons of the Storm, because they're heroes, and you can take up to 6. Keep in mind, they all have a 3-up save, 12 wounds, and a 5 plus ward, plus they heal every time they charge, and they can retreat and charge every single turn. Plus, they're giving a Holy Within bubble of +1 to wound for those Thralls. There is some amount of build around for this that's kind of interesting. Whether it's actually good, probably not, but they can do some work, especially if they get that charge off. So if you can alpha with those Eidolons, it could be interesting. That said, they're only counting for 2 bodies on objectives, but because you need to bring 30 Thralls, you're getting some more. So that's a total of 40 bodies in the max spam list. Then we can do it with 1 Kaelin King or Volturnos. So that puts us down to 4 Eidolons and 30 Thralls, and you got 60 to 80 points left over. You can do a Kaelin King and Volturnos, which gets you down to 3 Eidolons. But you got a Slap King in there. You got the Thralls. And then you can even take Lotan around to hang out with the Thralls. Or a Soul Render, Thrall Master. It's kind of getting interesting. And then you got the 1 Leviathan version, which is going to still be taking 3 Eidolons, 30 Thralls, 1 Leviathan, and then 1 of any of the smaller units as any unit, because you don't need it to be a hero. It could be a unit of 3 Eels, or a Shark, or Reavers, or Thralls, if you want to do more, excluding the Kings. Of course, if you have any bonus points and you want to upgrade one of your battle line Thrall units out, swap them out, you could help knock out the battle line that way. Or you could, of course, go into a particular sub-faction or have a King or Volturnos to allow your Eels. There's a lot of mix and match here, but you've already got a hero, so you don't technically need any more. So this is Super Elite Hero Hammer. The spam dude is a leader, so no further tax there. That's the typo there. Can swap in an Eidolon of the Sea, though I don't know if you want to spam them. 1 as your general is not a bad idea, because you could take that command trait that lets them cast infinitely, which is pretty cool. And then the rest could be your Eidolons of the Storm, and that only costs you 5 extra points, which you usually have left over for some of these builds. But I wouldn't stack them necessarily. And then you have the higher than normal objective control for such a list due to the obligatory Thralls. And you're free to choose the subfaction, but Domhain for the Thralls is probably default. The Eidolons don't really benefit from any of the other subfactions. Alright, so moving on to a concluding slide here. In general, spamming a given unit is often not optimal. I think we all know this intuitively, but there are some benefits to it. For example, knapsacking illustrates not only the max capacity for a given unit, say for your collection, if you were wondering, should I buy 5 turtles? No, you should not. You'll never be able to use it. But it's also a good starting point for pursuing a given build. And as we said, you can swap things in or out. The algorithm can also be utilized for more mixed combinations, giving caps on unit quantity. So for example, we already had a pair of restraints, like we have to have 1 to 6 leaders and minimum of 3 battle line, maximum of 4 behemoths. there's nothing stopping you from adding more. So let's say you want to bring at least 1 unit of 6 defensive eels as a screen. Then go for it. That's just another requirement on your knapsacking. Or you can say, I need to have at least a wizard. So then, in addition to whatever else I have. So the Tidecaster is the cheapest wizard you've got. So then you've got that. Or if you want to do, say, the null deploy list in Idoneth, in Briumdar, each Soul Scryer can bring 3 units along. So for every unit you need to bring along, you need a Soul Scryer. So that means you're going to need at least 2 Soul Scryers, because I don't think you can make the Thralls big enough to fill up 2,000 points, or any unit costly enough to fill up 2,000 points. Maybe you could do 1 Soul Scryer and 3 Turtles, but then it would have to be in Nautilus. So in general, you're going to have to take at least 2 Soul Scryers to make that work. And so you can kind of do the math on that, and you've got some more constraints. There are plenty of options for how you can flesh this out and what it could mean for your list building for any army, of course, not just Idoneth. But I hope you guys felt like this was a decent first explanation of how you can approach this with list building, and then what you could do with it for yourself is very applicable from the many different versions of list building restrictions we saw in Idoneth itself. And as always, thank you for watching. Please do feel free to like, share, and subscribe. As always, join the Discord community, add some comments. I'm happy to respond to any thoughts you have on this and future list building videos. In addition, we'll be having more tournament reports, Battle Tome reviews, Lumineth tactic guides and other tactic guides, and other Math Hammer videos coming in the near future. But in the meantime, Ryan out.